Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Amos in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Amos starts off, chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Amos, who was among the sheep herders from Tekoa. Tekoa is a little village just south of Bethlehem, located in the kingdom of Judah. That verse continues, which he envisioned in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now, I don't know exactly when the earthquake was, but we know roughly when these other kings are. Notice that he is living in Tekoa in the kingdom of Judah, but he's going to prophesy. He's going to prophesy to Israel. Now, chapter 7, verse 14 tells us a little bit more about Amos, where Amos answered and said to Amaziah, I am not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, for I am a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs. He hadn't been to profiteering school. That wasn't his background. Verse 15, but the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. And so God took him from his regular profession and sent him to prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel. So yes, he's from Tekoa in the south of Jerusalem, but his prophecy is going to be directed primarily. Now Judah's going to be mentioned, but primarily it's going to be focused in the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember that Israel and Judah were now two separate nations and had been since the death of Solomon. And sometimes they were at peace with each other, sometimes they were not. Israel was actually tended to be the more prosperous. It was larger, usually stronger. There were times where Judah and Israel had fought against each other, and when they did, Judah usually came out on the losing end of that proposition. So, chapter 1, verse 2, he said, the Lord roars from Zion, and from Jerusalem he utters his voice. If that sounds familiar, it's because we mentioned it back in Joel chapter 3 and verse 16. We had exactly the same phrase. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. Joel had ended, that wasn't the very last verse, but it was close to the end of his book. And now Amos picks up with that. It's almost like the passing of the baton, which makes me think, we said we weren't entirely sure when Joel was written, but I think Joel was probably written just before Amos, because I think this actually might be deliberate. So the Lord roars from Zion, from Jerusalem he utters his voice, and the shepherd's pasture grounds mourn, and the summit of Carmel dries up, and God's getting the attention of people, maybe with things that were described in the book of Joel. Remember, locust plague and natural disasters, maybe other things as well. When we talk about the summit of Carmel drying up, that sounds a bit maybe like springs and things like that are going dry. Verse 3, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke its punishment, because they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron. That is, the people of Damascus. Now those are pagans, and they had come down against Gilead. Gilead's on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're described as having threshed Gilead. That is, they came in and they sort of cut down all of the people in the cities, and they weren't very nice about it. Verse 5, I will also break the gate bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Aven, and him who holds the scepter from Beth Eden. So the people of Aram is the place where Damascus is, modern day Syria, will go exiled to Kir, says the Lord. Now, this starts off, notice we started that formula for 3 transgressions, and for 4, I have this against you, Damascus. And he begins with Damascus, but this is going to give rise to a whole series of woes, of judgments we start off around the surrounding nations. Next, he goes for 3 transgressions, and for 4, I have this against you, Gaza. That's the land of the Philistines. For 3 transgressions, and for 4, I have this against you, Tyre. That's the Phoenician city up on the coast, pagans. For 3 transgressions, and for 4, I have this against you, Edom. Now I can imagine the people of Israel to whom Amos has gone. They're hearing these judgments against Damascus and Gaza and Tyre, and they're thinking, "Oh, good, God's going to get all those pagans." And then they say Edom. Well, Edom sort of I mean, yes, they have their own God, but remember, the Edomites were actually distant cousins to the Israelites. Edom was from Esau, but we don't like them, and so that's okay. God's going to get them. And then we continue for 3 transgressions and for 4. I have this against you, Ammon. Now, Ammon was one of the sons of Lot, also distant cousins to the Israelites. But lately, and for the last a long period of time, they've been enemies of God's people, and so that's great. God's going to get them. And then for 3 transgressions and for 4, I have this against you, Moab, the other descendant of Lot, both Moab and Ammon, and God's going to get them too. And then for 3 transgressions and for 4, I have this against you, Judah. Well, now we're getting really close, because remember, Amos is from Judah, but Judah and Israel didn't always get along, but that's getting uncomfortably close. And now we come to the last one for 3 transgressions and for 4, I have this against you, Israel. And from now on, the rest of the book is going to be focused on the sin and the judgment, not of those other nations, but upon Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, that's chapters 1 and 2. We had for 3 transgressions and for 4, and a judgment against each one of those areas. Sometimes it's a city, sometimes it's a country. Chapters 3 through 6 now are focused on judgments against Israel. And we start off in chapter 3 where God says, you were my chosen people. And I blessed you, I took care of you, which means you should have, of all peoples, you should have been loyal to me. But you were not, and that's the problem. That's why judgment's coming. We get to chapter 4, verse 1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan who are on the mountains of Samaria. You think God's going to speak against the cows, the cattle? Well, no, look at the next line. You cows of Bashan who are on the mountains of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring now that we may drink. You see, this is actually a judgment against not the cows, but actually that's just a way of describing the wives of the Israelites. You say, well, wives aren't making the decisions. This was a man's world. It's men who were making the decisions. But wives were saying to their husbands, hey, can you get me some of those riches from other places? Can you do that even if it involves oppressing the poor and crushing the needy? Now, this tells me something about the book of Amos. Amos is going to be the prophet of social injustice. He's actually going to speak out against social injustice, against downtrodden, the poor and the needy, and not recognizing that they ought to be cared for. And sometimes we forget, and we think, well, we're living in a great nation, and that's wonderful. And it doesn't matter that other nations and other peoples are getting oppressed and working in sweatshops and really having very harsh conditions, as long as I get the things that I want to get. Do you hear the echo of our own day? Chapter 4, verse 2, the Lord has sworn by his holiness. Now, when God swears by something, so we notice that you have conditional promises, and sometimes God says, if you do this, then I'll do that. And then sometimes they are unconfirmed promises. Are they conditional or not? We can't tell. But here, it's an oath that God takes. God swore by his holiness, and here's the oath. Behold, the days are coming upon you when they will take you away with meat hooks, and the last of you with fish hooks. And if I read that not knowing the background, I think, well, maybe he's speaking figuratively. That's sort of a figure of Israel being caught like fish. But actually, we know from wall paintings in Nineveh that when the Assyrians came to take their captives, they literally would take meat hooks and fish hooks and put them through the lips or sometimes the nose of their captives. God's actually going to do this with Israel. We get to verse 6, but I gave you also cleanness of teeth in all your cities. That doesn't mean they were using nice toothbrushes or toothpaste. It means that they didn't have anything to eat. And lack of bread in all your places. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. That's the refrain. And we're going to see that refrain repeated. Verse 7, furthermore, I withheld the rain from you, while there was still 3 months until harvest. Rains would be in the winter months, and they'd sort of go out gradually. But notice this time it didn't go out gradually; it just stopped way early. And then I would send rain on one city, and on another city I would not send rain. One part would be rained on, while the part not rained on would dry up. So 2 or 3 cities would stagger to another city to drink water, but would not be satisfied. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Notice the second time that refrain comes up. Verse 9, I smote you with scorching wind and mildew, and the caterpillar was devouring your many gardens and vineyards, fig trees and olive trees. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Again, a third time. I sent a plague among you after the manner of Egypt. I slew your young men by the sword, along with your captured horses, and I made the stench of your camp rise up in your nostrils. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. In verse 11, I overthrew you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were like a firebrand snatched from a blaze. Yet you have not returned to me. Did you catch that? We have that refrain again and again, 5 times it's given. Where have I seen this sort of judgment with a refrain that's repeated 5 times? It's back in Leviticus chapter 26, where I have the blessings, but also I have the cursings. And in the cursings, remember that refrain, and I will punish you 7 times more, repeated 5 times. And I think you're supposed to hear this and be reminded of the judgments, because really they're the same judgments, where they are escalating and they're getting worse and worse and worse until finally they're overthrown. And that's what Amos just described. He's calling the curse from unfaithfulness that was given back in Leviticus 26. If you don't obey me, now anytime you want to stop this and turn back, that's okay, you can do that. But if you don't obey me, it's going to get worse and worse and worse until finally you are driven from the land. Chapter 4 then is that refrain, yet you have not returned to me. Chapter 5, there's a different refrain, only used 3 times. Seek me that you may live. That happens 3 times in chapter 5, a call to repent. And finally, we come to chapter 6, which is a judgment against the men. Chapter 4, we had the cows of Bashan, a judgment against the women. That doesn't mean that the men are spared. Chapter 6 is against the men. And this brings us now to chapter 7. In chapter 7, we're going to see 5 visions of judgment, symbolic visions. The first one, Joel sees a plague of locusts. He sees locusts coming, and Joel, I'm sorry, not Joel, Amos says, "Oh my Lord, please take it away. That's too much." And so he takes it away. And then he sees a vision of fire, and Amos says, "Oh, not that! Please, Lord, don't." And the fire is taken away. And then he sees a plumb line. Now, a plumb line is a string with a weight on the end. What you do is you hold it up to a wall, and it, because the weight is going to pull the string taut, and gravity does its thing. Gravity's sort of uniform, and so you can tell if the wall is straight or not. And he sees a vision of a plumb line, and the idea is that God is sort of checking out the northern kingdom of Israel. Are you straight or not? And they're not. They're as crooked as can be. So again, a sign of judgment. Next, there is a basket of ripe fruit. And the idea is that they are overly ripe for judgment. I mean, they are rotten, ready for judgment. And the 5th sign is the Lord, and he's standing by the altar. And remember how that we have a similar image in the book of Revelation, chapter 6. Remember how you have the 6 seals, but you get to the 5th one, and there are souls under the altar saying, "Lord, how long? How long is it going to be until you bring judgment?" And I think the idea is similar. The altar is a place of judgment. It's a place where sacrifices are made and animals are killed. And Israel, if you have not come to the altar and found forgiveness, then you're the one that's going to be on the altar. So watch out. We come finally to chapter 9, verses 11 to the end of the book, and there are some promises of restoration. So notice we've seen judgment, 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 but now we come at the end to a promise of restoration after the judgment. So it's restoration of Israel and of the nations, and it is forever. To look specifically at chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. In that day, I will raise up the fallen booth of David. Now let me read to the end now, and then I want to come back to that. And wall up its breaches, I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. So the question is, what is this fallen booth of David? Fallen booth, some translations might say the fallen tabernacle of David. This is the idea of David's descendants. And notice, in Amos's day, there were still David's descendants that were on the throne of Judah. But there's coming a day when that's not going to happen. But that's okay. This is looking to the future when the fallen booth of David will be raised up again. Well, that's speaking of Jesus. That's speaking of Jesus. How do I know? Because in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 15, verses 13 through 18, and this is the instance where the church had come together to ask the questions, can Gentiles be allowed into the church, or do they have to become Jewish proselytes? Do they have to convert to Judaism, and then they can be Christians? Because it's at that early date, initially, Christianity had been a strictly Jewish thing. It had not had Gentiles there. But the Apostle Paul had been bringing Gentiles, and of course Peter had led a Gentile and his family to the Lord, Acts chapter 10, with the story of Cornelius. And now the church was deciding, was that okay? Was that kosher? Was that allowed? And so they come together to talk about it. And Paul tells about his ministry, and Peter relays again his experience. He's actually already told the story in Acts chapter 11, but he tells it again in Acts 15. And then James gets up. James is one of the leaders of the church. Now, this is not James the apostle. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. And he gets up and he quotes this passage in Amos about how in that day I will raise up the fallen booth of David. And he says, that's speaking of Jesus. But he goes on down to the end. Notice in verse 12 that they may possess the remnant of Eden and all the nations who are called by my name. Did you catch that? There are nations that are called by the name of the Lord. That's the old goyim, the nations, the people that were not Jewish. And they were called by the name of the Lord. And so James concludes, well, because of that, Gentiles can be Christians too. and if you're not Jewish, it's okay. You can come into the church. Now, if you are Jewish, you belong there anyway. It's like this is your heritage. We're sort of hanging on. We've been sort of brought in. Can I call it this way? I don't mean to be mean, but we've been brought in the back door. But the church was Jewish, and we have been allowed to join it. Now, we have to be careful that we don't, in our arrogance, think, we have replaced Israel. It's not replacing. No, we're allowed into that remnant of something that was Israelite. And so you have become an heir of the promise, a partaker of the covenant, and one who is called by the very name of the Lord.